Hey, remember last week, former President Obama threw subtle shade at President Trump when he took credit for the strong economy. We'll refresh your memory. Here it is. He says, 11 years ago today, near the bottom of the worst recession in generations, I signed the Recovery Act, paving the way for more than a decade of economic growth and the longest streak of job creation in American history.
Well, President Trump couldn't possibly let that stand, and he responded with, "Did you hear the latest con job? President Obama is now trying to take credit for the economic boom taking place under the Trump administration." He had the weakest recovery since the Great Depression, despite zero Fed rate and massive quantitative easing. Now, best job numbers ever. Had to rebuild our military, which was totally depleted. Fed rate up, taxes and regulations way down. If Dems won in 2016, the USA would be in big economic depression and military trouble right now. The best is yet to come. Keep America great. Campus reform went to George Washington University to find out what some students thought about that. Take a listen.
Who do you think deserves credit for the good economy we have right now, Obama or Trump?
That's such a good question. I want to say Obama because, that's where my heart goes.
Obama.
I would say President Obama.
I think definitely Obama.
President Obama, just being that he got us out of the trenches from where we were.
Okay, we're going to explain this. Joining us now is Eduardo Neret. He's a digital reporter at Campus Reform, asking the tough questions there. Eduardo, it looks like majority of students gave credit to President Obama for the strong economy. What was their reasoning for that?
They did, and it's not surprising. You saw some of the responses in the video. A lot of the students were saying, well, we feel that President Obama got us out of this hole, that he got us out of the recession. But as you guys alluded to just prior to playing the video, it was actually the slowest recovery ever. So that's not true. And when I mentioned that to a lot of the students, when I mentioned some of the things that President Trump has done that has grown the economy exponentially, such as tax cuts, such as cutting regulations, they either sort of looked at me with a blank stare or went back to the original idea saying, well, we just feel like this was built off the backs of Obama. So it's clear to me that these students like Obama personally, and they're citing things like their feelings or their heart and wanting to like him, and that leads them to giving credit to him.
Now, they are in college right now, so you could assume, maybe some are working some part-time jobs to pay for college, but they aren't necessarily in the real world working the everyday 9-to-5 job, and they might not see the direct impact of the economy. Do you think that might have played into why their response was what it was?
Absolutely, and that's a great point. I talked to the students towards the end of the video, and I was sort of saying, why do you think that most Americans disagree with you? There was a recent Gallup poll that showed 62% of Americans would actually give credit to President Trump, and I pointed that out to the students, and they said, well, in fairness, they're out in the workforce. We're not working. Perhaps that's a reason, and I think that's a fair point. They haven't experienced the effects of the economy, but that's why it's important for groups out there, people like myself here at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, to talk to students about the facts of the economy and what's going on. Because if they're not in the workforce, if they're not experiencing it, and they're just on campus, they're not going to know otherwise how the economy has been growing and how President Trump's actions have contributed to that growth.
Eduardo, our inside guy here who's got all the good questions there on campus. We saw your interview. Good job there. A lot of people answered Obama. A lot of students answered Obama deserved the credit. Did anyone say President Trump deserved the credit?
I was out there for hours. One student said President Trump deserved the credit. I want to explain to your viewers why this may be the case. In addition to the fact that these students aren't in the workforce, people always talk about how biased the mainstream media is and how one-sided it is. Well, for your viewers to relate, that's how campuses are. And again, we show that at Campus Reform, how campuses have such a left-wing liberal bias view to students. So, for example, we've reported on how professors in the classroom bash Republicans, bash President Trump. And when you're going to class every day, when you're in an environment that is only giving the liberal viewpoint, and when you don't hear about the successes of the Trump administration, you're going to think that every good thing that's coming in the country, every good thing that we see in the economy is going to be credited to a liberal. So that's part of the reason why we're seeing this. It's part of the bias on campus. Like I said, just sort of like the bias that we see in the mainstream media.
It does seem to be kind of a bubble that people could live in when they're living in college. But a lot of these people, could be first-time voters. So, when they're heading to the ballot box and they're hearing from certain candidates on the left side, hey, my student loans will be eliminated, free health care for all. How much is this playing into a factor of, what they're voting for when they're college age, as opposed to 4 years from now when they'll actually be out in the real world? And what should they consider when they do head to the polls?
There seems to be a disconnect between them wanting to satisfy their needs of student loan debt, but then realizing down the line how they would likely pay more in taxes to pay for that. So I've done several videos. I've gone on several campuses and talked to students, asking them what issues are important to them. And a lot of them do say student loan debt is key. They cite other things in the economy. And so when you have candidates out there like Bernie Sanders talking about socialism, telling them, I'm going to forgive your student loan debt, you could see why these students go along that path. You can see their thinking there. But unfortunately, what they're not aware of is the dangers that socialism can bring. Again, we've seen socialisms in countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua destroy economies. And so it's important for people to explain that to some of these students. I try to do that in my videos. I would say the one silver lining is when I often talk to students and I say, well, you know, if your student debt is forgiven, someone's taxes are going to have to go up. You're going to have to pay for other people's student debt to be forgiven. They do kind of take a step back and they say, well, you know what, I'm going to give that a bit more thought. So it shows that if we can just present them with the other side, if we can present them with the facts of what these socialist policies will do, perhaps they will rethink their support for them.
All right, Eduardo, real quick, what's next for campus reform? What do you got on the docket?
Just released a video this morning about student reactions to Bernie Sanders' comments on Cuba from 60 Minutes. I didn't tell the students that it was Bernie Sanders who said it. I asked them, which politician do you think said this? They all said Trump. When I pointed out it was Bernie Sanders, I sort of, wanted to get the reaction of whether they were surprised and whether they were concerned that Bernie would be praising an authoritarian regime like Cuba. So definitely very interesting stuff there. I hope to come on soon to discuss that as well.
Yeah, I want to see that. Very creative way of pitching that. That is Eduardo Neret, digital reporter at Campus Reform. Always a pleasure to have you on, Eduardo. Thank you very much.